we'll continue on. And Councillor Mancinelli, you were up next.
So, as I spoke earlier, I guess I shouldn't have said motion, I should have said an amendment. Stepping into council, one of the motivating factors was the stadium for me and how it was placed with such a big investment and what we could hope to get from outcomes from it. I think that all the voices today talked about the importance of placing an investment where it's most likely to get you the best outcomes, not just for providing the features that it's offering to the public, such as swimming. Bodies are what builds economies, and bringing people together boosts our economy. So with that in mind, I move that Councillor Bob Hawkins and Real President and CEO Tim Reid assemble and co-chair a committee to be known as the Catalyst Committee, with responsibility to, number one, prepare a report and recommendations respecting the findings of the Arena Planning Study Committee, the Aquatics Facility Feasibility Study, and the Baseball Needs Assessment, including the siting, staging, and financing of these potential civic infrastructure projects, along with any other related civic infrastructure projects which, when considered together, create an economic, recreational, cultural, placemaking, and activation opportunity for Regina and its citizens in the decades ahead. 2, pay close attention to how these identified opportunities, when considered collectively, could interact and reinforce each other to create a transformative movement in the growth of our city of Regina. 3, engage and consult with the community, city, administration, and with the city planners and other experts, locally and externally, on leading practices for advancing and realizing these opportunities. And finally, 4, report back to City Council with recommendations by Q4 of 2022. Can I have a seconder?
Any questions on the amendment? Would anyone like to speak to it? Okay, Councillor Stevens, go ahead.
Yeah, the intention is clear. So we would actually package these 3 reports and essentially refer them to this process. Is that correct?
Totally. I don't want to make these decisions in a silo or the outcomes from placement and what might come together. I think that mistakes been made in the past.
Okay, and who would take the lead on who's on that committee? Is it kind of the status quo committees we have working on these projects, or is that to be determined?
I think it would be determined. Named off Councillor Hawkins and Mr. Reid to get it up and started. I'm sure they both have enough pull to get the proper members together and assemble to do a good job.
Okay, thanks.
Just a clarification. So you would have Mr. Tim Reid and Councillor Hawkins pull a committee together? It would be up to them, or how would this committee be formed?
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, I would imagine they would lead and start up the committee and it would pull together and formalize from there.
Councillor Finder, you're blinking. Is that just to the main report? Okay, thank you. Any other questions in this regard? Okay, seeing none.
Maybe I should ask a question. Is
Call a
Councillor
question.
Hawkins and Mr. Reid okay with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Mr. Reid, do you want to respond? Actually, I would appreciate a response from you. Mr. Curd?
I'm appreciative of the confidence. I think it's important, and certainly in keeping with our recommendation. Obviously, I'd have to confirm with our board of directors, as at the end of the day, I do report to them. Their position has always been whatever the need is of council, that they would be sort of supportive of. So I would just want to validate that our board was supportive of it. Maybe a functional question of, I'm assuming this becomes a committee of council, and at some point, Councillor Hawkins and myself would come back to you with some terms of reference and an approved overview of membership and those type of things. So there's maybe some functional questions that I would have. In principle, I think we will support whatever you would like as council. I'm sure our board will be the same, but I do have to ask for permission before I can give you a firm answer.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Hawkins.
If council wishes, I'd be happy to serve in this committee. I think that, let me say this, I think that the expertise which Mr. Reid brings is absolutely critical in making this committee work, and I'd be happy to assist him in any way I could.
Thank you, Councillor Hawkins. Okay, and Councillor Stadnichuk, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Through the chair, I'm curious. I'm just trying to assess this. If this committee was not formed, would there be a process through the administration for these kinds of discussions to happen? I'm just trying to get a sense of, would this happen anyway, or is there a need for a focused approach? I'm not sure if administration could answer that.
Sure. Mr. Nicol, do you want to take that?
Sure. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. With respect to your question, Councillor Stadnichuk, I would expect that the motivation and objective of Councillor Mancinelli's motion is to ensure that going forward, these various projects and other potential ones are looked at from an aggregate perspective, in the sense that it was already touched upon in the earlier comments at the beginning of the meeting, that we really need to be prudent and avoid any kind of project of this magnitude or projects of this magnitude going ahead in isolation. Because then what happens is it's a first in, get all the funding or whatever, without a view to how could we work together on this? How do we access the various potential funds from the federal government, perhaps the provincial government or other entities? So it's a matter of working together. It was also mentioned, the private sector, there's an expectation that it will be coming to the table with dollars over the years that Mr. Reid commented on earlier. So I would be very supportive from an administrative point of view that some kind of oversight, coordinating quarterback of all these projects is very warranted and is particularly constructive, particularly when we're dealing with projects of this size, magnitude, and financial requirement.
Okay, thank you. And so secondly, there already exists, which hasn't met very often, a city centre core committee, whose name I always forget because it's got so many. So does that play that function in any way, or this kind of work would be beyond what that city centre core committee is doing?
Mr. Nicol?
Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. From my perspective, this committee may well connect with the City Centre Core Development Advisory Committee as a potential stakeholder and input, someone to engage with and consult. But I think, from what I understand, it would be appropriate that this would be standalone. It may well touch on some of the similar membership on that committee, but again, the focus is this is a huge entity. This is a huge transformational project that is going to take place, if approved by council, ultimately over a number of years. So I see this as being a standalone entity.
Councillor Stadnichuk?
Okay. Yeah, I think that's, I'm still wondering whether or not there's, I'll leave it at that, I guess. Thank you.
You can think about it. Councillor Hawkins? Or no, sorry, Councillor Zakiniak.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, does this amendment, is there still an amendment on the floor in relation to the feasibility study for the baseball stadium, or is this amendment in lieu of that?
Thank you. I'll ask the city clerk to speak to this.
Through you, Madam Chair, my understanding is that the main motion on the floor is the recommendation that's contained in the baseball report. And in addition to that, Councillor Mancinelli has brought forward this amending motion. So if the amending motion passes, we will then vote on the main motion that's contained on the floor right now, that's noted in the baseball report.
Okay.
In the baseball needs assessment report.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Shaw.
Just to get some clarification, Councillor, I remember when that all came to us about the city centre core, the reason and the intent behind that was so that we're not working in silos, so that we have everybody with a vested interest in all the different areas within Regina to come together with the ideas. So it's almost like a committee upon a committee upon a committee, and I'm not really understanding why this is needed, but if somebody can help me clarify this through the chair?
Who would like to take that just to expand on the purpose and the reason for this? Okay, go ahead. Just 1 second. Go ahead, Councillor Mancinelli.
Thank you. I guess being my second term, I've witnessed the referencing of silos so many times I can't even count it. We have 3 different needs identified today before us in our meeting so far. They all have very good outcomes and purposes. Today we can see how they tie in, but 3 years from now, when one gets funding, one doesn't, one falls to the side, we might not. And this is to prevent those silos from happening, to make sure when we make these large investments that they are catalysts for the other economic factors within our city. The city centre might only be focused on between Albert and Broad, College and Dewdney, and some of these things might fall outside of those borders. This is to make sure that those silos don't get built within our city again when we're coming upon a time where we have so many aged assets that have to be replaced, that as we're making those investments, we make sure that they're made to try to recover every dollar that we can out of smart investments that get well used by the public and spur other economic activity.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Just to add one further perspective to that, the City Centre Core Advisory Committee was primarily struck to forge ongoing relationships between major parties and players in the downtown area. This Catalyst Committee is much more focused on specific projects, so it's a much more project-focused oriented entity. The Community Centre Core, or the City Centre Core Advisory Committee, was struck primarily to forge and enhance relationships that had been seen to have been either frayed or non-existent to some extent. So that's the distinction. So there's no intention for overlap here, Councillor. It's a legitimate question, and it's I think an observation that others might make, but I'm hoping that by me distinguishing a project-focused entity versus a relationship body, that would allay your concerns. Keeping in mind that the Catalyst Committee can certainly engage with the City Centre Core Advisory Committee because some of the same players are involved, but it is not meant to be a duplication.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Shaw.
Thank you. So just to add to that, Mr. Nicol, obviously I'm a new councillor, and obviously I don't have all the history of all the stuff that's gone on before that the Councillor Mancinelli does. As a recommendation from you and from administration to go forward with this, is this accurate in my assumption through the chair?
Mr. Nicol?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. With respect to your question, Councillor Shaw, we think that upon first blush at looking at this, I think there is great merit in doing this. These are large transformational projects that are going to potentially take place over a number of years. Of course, all subject to approval and consideration and approval by council. So this will not be the last time that these kind of things are discussed. In fact, the amendment includes a report back to council with recommendations by Q4 of this year. Again, I think we've all seen the need to have some kind of quarterback that's looking at these to ensure that you don't get one-offs or the first in the door gets all the cash and then we wonder, well, how come that happened, or why didn't we access this particular federal funding, or did we know that there was a grant for underground thermo? Like, there's a lot of things. This is to make sure that we don't act in silos, that we don't forego any potential funding options from other levels of government, and to ensure that all the players, both us, the main players, and those in the private sector are brought into the tent so that we can actually make this a huge success.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate your honesty. Thank you and your advice.
Okay, seeing nothing further, I will ask the clerk to call the question. On the amendment, yeah.
Through you, Madam Chair, the motion carries 8-1 with the following members voting in favor as follows. Councillors Zakidniak, Hawkins, Shaw, Bresciani, Mancinelli, Stevens, Findura, and Mayor Masters. And voting against is Councillor Stanachuk.